Hey everybody, it's Laura Kingen of Sensory Solutions Inc. Welcome. Today I want to talk about hypoactivity or depressed. What does that mean, and can we address that, especially through a sensory approach? I have lots of demos available to you all. In the last couple of weeks, I addressed hyper and aggressiveness in the last 2 weeks or so. I know a lot of people are talking about, my child gets is very busy and has meltdowns and has all this behavior. And so I tried to address that in these videos of these last couple of weeks. But there's also those parents that are like, my kid doesn't do that. Is my child autistic? Or my child is autistic, they don't have those meltdowns. What's the deal on that? So I'd like to address that today, because really that's like the other end of the spectrum when we're dealing with autism in particular. It's a continuum of hypoactivity, hyperactivity, and anything in between. And so very often we hear about those kids who have the meltdowns and the behaviors and are acting out, and you can't settle them down and they can't sleep and they're off and running. But what about the kids on the other end of the spectrum that are just kind of sitting in the corner, not really requiring much attention? They might be like kind of focused in on their own thing. What about those children? We hear less about them because they're less the behavior problem. So I want to talk about that today. So that's kind of my lead in right away. In these demos, how I've done it, and I've got a lot of videos now online. I do an introduction, we do like a classroom portion where I introduce some concepts, and then we do a lab portion where I do active activities. And what I'd like to do for today is spend actually little time talking in this kind of sit-down classroom portion and do some active kinds of things. And in the active portion, to be able to really demonstrate to you some ideas that maybe you can do at home. I mean, that's really the takeaway is, especially in these times, it's really hard to either find a therapist or get to a therapy session. So with my background as a nationally registered occupational therapist with almost literally 40 years of experience, to share with you some of the things that I have learned over these 40 years so that you can utilize them for your own home application. I am also licensed by the state of Arizona to practice occupational therapy. I'm offering these demos worldwide, really as an education for you all. This is not meant to be a therapy, an individualized, personalized therapy session, even though there are therapy strategies going to be presented to you all. But these are just suggestions for you all, just general suggestions in these this demo that I offer to you. The idea is to give you some different suggestions and then make it your own. My shirt, your pace. See that? Your pace or mine. So it's really about, I can give you all these kind of suggestions, but it's really up to you to make it your own and make it valuable for your own needs. That's one of the biggest tips, is there's no one right way of doing things in a generalized way. The idea is each individual has their own needs. And as an occupational therapist, a registered occupational therapist, we go through a process where we evaluate, and I get to know the individual and what their needs are. Do they tend towards hyperactivity? Do they tend towards hypoactivity? And then that is going to guide my course of treatment. But it's individualized for that particular person based on an evaluation and then a treatment plan. We're not doing that in this session, but just offering some general strategies. Having said that, please be safe, okay? This is an offering to you all. It's free. There are things that I will suggest that can be dangerous if done without appropriate supervision. So please be careful. But let me say, especially during this pandemic, I've certainly benefited from people coming online and offering freebies, free support. And this is a way that I feel like I can offer my support to you all, because I know autism is an issue around the world. Next week, in fact, I will be doing a webinar. So welcome to all of you who are on the family support. Shoot, I should have looked at. I'm sorry, I should have looked at the title of your Facebook group. But it's about family support, and heads up to hi to Josie in the Philippines. She's been doing some offering webinars through Facebook Live. Last week, she had teacher Anna speak. I felt like I was listening to my twin, like what she was saying as an occupational therapist was so much what I would have suggested as well. And she's in the Philippines around the world, halfway around the world. So there's some very common themes that we have in autism. I know there's the whole thing about labeling, but it does help to categorize and guide certainly professionals. And so there's commonalities around the world is the point that I wanted to make. So welcome to you all. A lot of new subscribers on my Facebook page, SSI. My business is Sensory Solutions, Inc. So that's my main resource. You can look there and you can find all kinds of information about the videos that I've been doing. And that's the primary thing that I've been offering free. But the different sessions that I've been offering, certainly these are free sessions that's available, but then there's paid sessions. I have several different tiers worth of services that are available to you all, whether you come once or on an ongoing basis. But to offer to you all telehealth, actual therapy services, but also telehealth education. So depending on if you really want to work directly and do therapy services or educational services, there's different kinds of ways that OTs can help you, and certainly myself. So having said that, let's get a little more into the hypo. Let me talk a little bit, because it is the opposite of hyper. So my approach to working with somebody who is more hypoactive is kind of the opposite of what I would do with somebody who is hyperactive. I always like to talk about my self-regulation kind of a thing where in sessions and even in these sessions, I start out kind of talking, kind of even keel, and then we build and we'll get busy and then we'll calm back down, because many kids who are hyperactive, it's like they get busy and then they're unable to calm themselves back down. And so what happens is they end up going off and running. Same thing with emotional regulation. We can get so emotionally caught up in our distress, our emotional distress, that we start feeling the emotion and then the emotion heightens, and we need to have that regulation to bring ourselves back down. And certainly there's so much stress in this pandemic. How are we calming ourselves back down rather than just going off and running and then causing perhaps some dangerous situations? So this self-regulation, these waves that we go through in our day, we start out in the morning, we build, we work, we get busy, and then we come home, and then we calm back down. So we have these waves of activity in our day. But often with autism, and not just limited to autism, but like I said, emotions and whatnot, that interruption, those waves can be interrupted. So they can be big spikes or very little, how do I want to say, arousal in their functioning. And that's who we're really talking about today, are these hypoactive individuals. I tend to emphasize autism the most. But in this title, I purposely use the term depressed because there are individuals who are psychiatrically depressed, where I believe that sensory interventions could be helpful. So what I'm going to offer to you today can be applicable to that. May not be the whole picture by any means, right? But the idea is to give you all some suggestions on how to handle the depressed or hypo, kind of flatlined. People aren't really doing much spiking in their activity at all. So my approach as an occupational therapist, again, is to evaluate. And often there are physiological interventions that we could use to help address that depressed state. And that's what I want to more actively speak with you about today. You can go back and look at the different videos. I've done it purposefully where I can now reference back. There's lots of different topics where I'm kind of layering on top of one another. So these last couple of weeks, and I kind of go through themes too. So these last couple of weeks, I've been referencing the swing, which you can see behind me. God bless you. I've asked my husband to join us today. He's the one who sneezed. So in the one video, you can see his drum kit. In this video, not so much. Let's see if I can kind of see the tinges of his drum kit. And that's kind of a segue. Is the approaching the hypoactivity through the physiological arena. Even more specific than that is the neurophysiological arena. It's our brain. My business is Sensory Solutions, Inc. So what we're working on is our senses, and we know about our 5 senses. In fact, one of my previous videos is about sensory diet. So we talk about vision, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touch. And with touch, we break that into deep pressure and light touch. So like a Swedish massage and squeezing, weighted blankets, that is working on deep pressure, which is very different than light touch. Most people find light touch as alerting, is kind of waking us up. It's safety. You know, if you brush up against something that could be dangerous, it just takes a little bit to know, oh, I need to move away, right? As opposed to deep pressure. Most people respond to deep pressure as calming. Several other concepts that go along with those 5 senses is the sense of movement and the sense of interoception. So when we talk about mindfulness, we're talking about being able to kind of, instead of like kind of always looking outside of our bodies, is to literally go inside our bodies and tune in. Feeling this, if you're sweating, if you're breathing heavy, if your heart is beating, if there's certain pains inside your body, is tuning inside your body. So that interoception or mindfulness is such a key part of what we're trying to work on here. Now, granted, if somebody's autistic, they may not necessarily have those full skills and abilities, communication and language, to be able to be versed. But as a therapist or as a caregiver, it's something that I want to pay attention to. But the importance of movement, when we talk about our senses, and when we talk about that physiological process of trying to make an impact on somebody who is hypoactive. So let's explore that some more. I think the final point I just want to emphasize is, again, we're doing kind of the opposite, where if somebody is hyperactive or tends to be like, next week I'm going to talk about overstimulation. So it's very similar, where somebody just stays really busy and hyper and just has difficulty calming down. So I would kind of meet that person at that higher level and try to steer them down. And I would use sensory mechanisms. I mean, it's almost like it's so simple. But it's still profound because you need to know the individual you're working with and what their needs are. So when we're going to address hypo, the person is very low, and so what I'm trying to do is boost them up. And we're going to use the different sensory arenas. Now, this room is kind of dark, actually. And paying attention to the different senses, and think of the continuum. Let's just say vision. If it's somebody who's hyper, then I want to reduce the stimulation. If it's somebody who's hypo, I may want to boost it up. So think about the person who is hypoactive in your that you're taking care of. Do they tend to sit in a room that's kind of dark, kind of quiet, not much movement, not much energy flow, no plants growing? Consider that environment and where they are. They may like that. This is where it gets tricky, because I would want to know the individual and how much stimulation I can give that hypoactive individual at any one time. Because if I come in too strong, I'm gonna lose them, or I'm never gonna connect in with them. So I want to go in quiet and steer into the curve and see if I can boost their energy level, their arousal up. So some of this may be very subtle, like, for example, lightening up the room. I'm not going to do that for purpose of this demo, but I want to point out these different considerations, okay? So think about what's in the room. If it's a hypoactive individual, maybe they need to have more visual stimulation. Maybe if they're bedridden, maybe having a mobile around over their head. Be careful with flashing lights. If anybody has seizures, flashing lights can trigger seizures, so be careful with that. A lot of classrooms can be very visually stimulating. That can be helpful for somebody who's hypoactive, but be careful about somebody who is hyperactive. A lot of visual, like in the corner of the room, you see the handwriting with the letters and all kinds of visual posters and books and colors and chairs. That can be too much for a hyperactive child. Maybe erring a little that way with a hypoactive child, if that makes sense. Same principle with sound. Although I would think, generally speaking, I wouldn't have a lot of distracting sounds as a whole, whether it's somebody who's hyper or hypo, because that can just reinforce a hypoactive child's need to just stay into their own world. I mean, I think that that's a very classic description of somebody with autism, is like they're in their own world. What I've discovered is a lot of those children are actually so sensitive. It's like they don't have that defense, that protective barrier. And so that's part of the reason why they're so kind of tuned in. But it can also be the physiological brain processing, neurological processing that's slowed, or is just not making those connections. And so what we're trying to do at a very low level of the brain is to wake up that reticular activating system, work on that organization, and help the brain wake up at that lower level to then be able to send impulses up to the higher parts of the brain, where we do require higher level skills to function, certainly academically, but in organization for, say, chores or activities of daily living. Hypoactive child may not necessarily do much as I'm taking care of my hair as I'm trying to talk, right? But a hypoactive child, depending, may not just have that energy. Now, just on a very side note, there's discussion about meds, food, dietary issues, supplements. As an occupational therapist, we really work with activities, and so dealing with dietary issues, supplements, is really outside our realm of licensure. We can talk about it more from an ADL or an activities, a daily living skills kind of a perspective, but my perspective is looking at activities, and I'll defer you to, I'm not sure who to defer you to. The dietary stuff is really complicated and really mixed up, especially in today's modern day. But certainly dietary issues can impact a hypoactive individual. If you're eating poorly and you're not feeling well, that could certainly be impacting. I mean, that's first, and that would be part of the evaluation process. Is there anything else that's even going on? So that's something to consider as well. But having ruled those kinds of things out, we can certainly address sensory issues. So those principles that we were addressing with hyper, where we want to calm down, with a hypo, we want to boost up. So with like the deep pressure, for most people, deep pressure is calming. So with somebody who is hypo, I want to do maybe more light touch. I have found with most of my kids, almost everybody, there's tactile issues, there's touch issues, whether it's a hypo or hyper. So I like to do brushing, and in the last video I did on aggression, I showed you all this brushing technique. So this is going to kind of segue into this lab portion where we want to brush. I don't want to push real hard. I don't know how this is being conveyed. I mean, you guys know this kind of a brush. I want to cover the surface area of the body. And some of this is actually working the lymph system. So we're kind of working the toxins as well. But what we're really trying to do is impact the tactile system. So we're going to start this lab section with sense of touch. And I'm going to need to adjust, I think. Well, I'll just do it this way. I'll show you on my arm, but then I would also take it and do it on our legs. Well, I could do that. So as I'm talking, I'm going to brush my leg. I'm starting distal proximal. I'm starting away from my body. I'm sitting on a ball too. So by nature, what I'm doing is I am sitting on an exercise ball. I'll show you this in a little bit. So I've got one foot on the floor. My bottom is on the ball. I have one leg up. That right there is working on increasing my arousal, my energy level. It's making my brain have to work more. And then I'm adding adding a task on it, a fine motor task that's working on my sense of touch. So when we talk about sensory integration, although I'm very careful with that term, I prefer sensory processing. We're trying to do something integrative. We're trying to, I'm giving myself, in this example, input for my brain to do something with. My brain is taking all this information, doing something with it, and then having some kind of output, some kind of response, some kind of adjustment. Because I am not liking that video. So by nature, I'm giving myself input, my brain is doing some through process, and then I'm having some kind of output, like being able to maintain my balance on this ball. To be able to sustain a posture requires input, throughput, and output. And that's really important. Because I can do this brushing, and then I want to watch and see how the person I'm working with is responding. And instead of me coming in and saying, I want this to happen or do this, I need to pay attention to the responses of the person that I'm working with. It's really important, and that's why I'm emphasizing it. Because then, based on what the individual is doing, is going to guide me on what my next steps are going to be, okay? So the first part of the session is doing this kind of tactile. And I'm assuming that my individual, my client, is responsive enough to this. I have worked with some people that just will not do the brush at all. But they tend to be more the hyper, overstimulated kinds of kids who are just so sensitive that they just can't, it's too much. And so over time, I want to desensitize. But the hypoactive children tend to be like, yeah, okay, whatever you want to do. So I like to have a basket of tactile textures that they can pick from, maybe some lotion. Because a lot of the hypoactive individuals are unable to seek out sensory input adequately for themselves. So as an adult, I'm coming in and offering it for them. So much of what we're going to do is over-accentuate the sensory input, exaggerate the sensory input to kind of hit where their brain is at, to help create more connections in the brain. Like I use the term waking up the brain. So starting out by working with the brush or these different textures is helping to wake up the tactile. I didn't mention smell or taste so much, and I rarely use taste, but I do have a diffuser with essential oils. Now, if I have a pet, I wouldn't do this with pets. So if you have pets, be very careful about essential oils, and be very careful about any artificial anything. But certainly the scents, I think the chemicals can contribute to, dare I say, just be careful with the chemicals. But being conscious of the olfactory or the smells can help also wake up the brain, because what we're trying to do, like I said, is exaggerate the sensory input. So again, I rarely work with food in my sessions or with taste unless that's part of my treatment plan. But I can work on the smell, I can work on the visual, I can work on the hearing, I can work on sense of touch, I can work on movement. So as we go, I'm going to move into talking with you about the swing. But I also want to add the sound. Oh, because I'm starting kind of quiet. Where do I want to go with this? But I want you to also have an experience, so that by going through this video, you'll have some ideas on actually how to do it. Getting a little tongue-tied here. So I've asked my husband, Kevin Kingan, to contribute some sound. So see how I'm working with the different senses to help address hypoactivity, okay? So having said that, Kevin, if you would go ahead and just very subtly, even though I'm still going to be talking, if you would maybe just play the cymbals and add some auditory sound to this demo, that would be great. And as he's doing this, I want to talk about the swing. So with the movement, reference last week, there were some different kinds of things I talked about with the swing that I'm not going to get into today. But briefly, if it's a hypoactive child, they may be extra sensitive. So I'm going to be very conscientious about the height of this swing. Make sure it's safe. I really don't want you to see how I've attached the swing. Don't do it if it's not safe, okay? For purposes of this demo, this is safe. How high up off the ground the height of the swing is important. This is bothering me. I want to change this video here. I think you guys are okay. Oh, that actually is pretty good. So, the height off the ground. Some kids, probably more the hyper kids, if you have it too high up off the ground, you'll know about it. They'll tell you. But a hypoactive child may not tell you, especially if they're nonverbal. So watching them, knowing how their height will give me the idea of how far up off the ground the swing should be. It's a serious consideration, and it's something that I think we tend to neglect. But watching for the person's response. Are they kind of leaning into it and be like, yes, I like this? Or are they kind of backing off? That tells me that maybe what I'm presenting needs to either be adjusted or it's right on. In my evaluation, I also determine if my individual likes to move more or if they're more touch-oriented. And that's going to guide my treatment as well. So, let me backtrack here. So let's say this is my client, okay? I may want to put them in this swing and give them some movement. There's different ways I can position them. So this client is going to be kind of sitting, but I may want to have them lie down. They can lie down on their belly, lie down on their back. Again, depending on their tolerance and where they're at, let me do it this way. Let me go back and forth this way. I may want to do just a little bit of swinging. Keep in mind, there's some visual. There's the smells from my diffuser of the essential oils. There's sound going on. Now, I may put some kind of texture, something or other in the swing to accent, like bean bags. If it's somebody who's hypoactive though, if I do too much deep pressure, they may go to sleep. For most people, like I said earlier, the deep pressure is calming, which I have a tendency to help them be more mellow. So I may not want to do deep pressure with this individual. On the same token, if I go back and forth very rhythmically, this can have a calming influence on the nervous system. So for the hyperactive individuals out there, doing something rhythmical back and forth like this would be very calming. What would be contraindicated for hyperactive kids is to do a lot of jerky movement. But for somebody who is hypo, kind of needs their arousal level to be woken up more, I'm going to want to maybe do some jerky kinds of things. Cue the music. See how very fortunate we have this extra benefit. Keep it going, please. This extra benefit of having a musician working with us today. So I might want to do some of this. And then with the sound, maybe a high five or a little bump. You might bump into the ball. It's a very arrhythmical, wake up kind of a, but I have to know my client. I have to know my individual and watch what they're doing. And so far, this client, he's good. He's kind of like, oh, perking up. Okay? I know not all of you have a swing, but movement in general, and anybody who's been around OTs for very long, especially sensory-oriented OTs, we love swings, and there's a reason for it. There's many, many things we can do with swings. The very basic thing is that it's getting movement input, and then we can structure that however we'd like. So I think that's about it on the swing that I want to share with you. These developmental balls, or exercise balls, I call them developmental balls. That goes back a long time, I guess. These offer, depending on how you use them, deep pressure and movement. And that's one of the reasons why we love these exercise balls. When I choose an activity, the art of the therapy is finding activities that can be integrative, like I said, and incorporate a variety of different kinds of performance components that we're trying to address with our client. And the exercise balls really address a lot of great stuff. So, let's talk a little bit more about that. Now, this client I have that I'm working with today is small. So, this big exercise ball is going to be too big for this client today. So let's stick with this smaller ball. If my child is hypoactive, they could be nonverbal and non-ambulatory. So that means they don't walk, they don't talk, they may have contractures, maybe they have cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is really outside the realm of autism, but I mention it because they could be hypoactive, and we could use sensory approaches in therapy for a hypoactive cerebral palsy individual. But a lot of individuals with autism also are nonverbal. Although a lot of that, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't walk. Or maybe they can walk but have a lot of coordination issues. So I'm kind of belaboring this point about positions. That depending on the postural security of my client, I mentioned with the swing how high up off the ground the swing should be. Well, the same thing with the balls. This ball is kind of big. My client may not like it, maybe too high up off the ground. So I may want even a smaller ball. This ball, my client's feet are up off the ground, and that may be too much. So it's for the individual. Each individual is going to be different. But the idea is this is let's see if I can get situated here. So the idea is that this is a hypoactive client, and I want to wake them up. So I may put them on their belly, and I can roll them. But remember what I said about asymmetrical or arrhythmical movement. I'm going to try to apply those principles with this hypoactive child, depending on the responses that I'm getting back from this client. So I can do some forward and backward movement. I may want to go around in a little bit of a arrhythmical fashion, and see, the music is great. It's that auditory is adding to what I'm doing, which is accentuating and exaggerating that sensory input. And it's like a subtle but profound way of trying to impact the brain, the physiology. So we're gonna do some forward movement, backward movement. We're gonna bounce around, getting some sound. We have this essential oils, so there's smells going on, moving around. Now I may want to put something visual in front of me. And can you feel how even in this session we're starting to wake up a little bit more, right? And I see my client is starting to add something that he wants to do. And I'm going to say, go for it. Because he's creating that. And that's giving me feedback. He's into what I'm doing. You ever say, my client is like, oh, well, I'm going to try that. Then they're hooked in, and it's coming from within them. Okay? So we're wanting to build, wake up. And then depending on my treatment plan and what I'm wanting to do with this individual, whether it's academics or ADLs, activities, daily living skills, I may add another component into this activity to help target and refine those issues. Because now this client is awake. See, now he wants to sit up. Okay? And maybe do some reaching and high fives. Maybe not throw him, but throw a ball somewhere. So this is the basis of the activity, and then I can add more activity onto this. Okay? Now, at the end of our sessions, always like to do quiet time, that bringing it back down. But because this is somebody who's been hypoactive, and I've just barely woken this person up, I don't want to put him back to sleep. But that's counter to most of my sessions. For the most part, we want to really calm back down. So with this guy, he's now kind of awake. So our quiet time is going to be shorter, less involved. And I think for this one, we'll just keep the music going with the cymbals. And we'll take 3 slow, deep breaths in and out. So we've kind of peaked, and we're just going to calm down a little bit, and then we'll finish our session, okay? So let's take a deep breath in and out. It's really important to go slow, especially on the exhale. And if you can do it with your mouth closed, that's great. So let's do it again. Breath in and out. And then let's do one more. Deep breath in and out. So did you have a good time today? Yeah? So I hope this was helpful to you all. Individuals who are hypoactive can still benefit greatly from sensory strategies. So best wishes. I'm available. If you would like some individualized consultation or individualized assistance, let me know. Hope you all have a great day. Hope this has been helpful. Thank you. Bye.